Greetings to baristas. In years of yore, in the history of U.S. capitalism, there used to be what were called company towns. These were industrial communities that were either the private property of an employer or a public community, so far under the thumb of a capitalist investor that they were indeed but an extension of his ruling hand. These were especially noted in extractive industries like mining and lumber. They usually came complete with their own local security force with police powers, with titles like the Coal and Iron Police of Pennsylvania's anthracite coalfields, with legal powers of arrest on company property, remanding the malefactor to a civic court. Hearings were not usually held in company towns proper, but it was a foregone conclusion that anyone displeasing to the property owner would not find a favorable verdict before any local magistrate. Company towns were notorious for ensnaring workers in debt obligations through control of housing and rents therein, forcing workers to buy groceries and hard staples at monopoly prices, and even supplying the tools necessary for employment, all available at the so-called company store, whose sole purpose was to retain labor through dependency to their creditors/employers. Very often these debts were not redeemed in the public coin of the realm, that is, the US dollar issued by the US Treasury, but a soft currency called scrip, aptly called monopoly money by some because that's precisely what it was. Some of you might be old enough to remember the song 16 Tons, first recorded commercially by Merle Travis in 1946, made popular by Ernie Ford in 1955. It goes, another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company stove. This was more than a so-called country classic in popular music. The generation for whom it was written were old enough to know exactly to what the song referred to. Industrial peonage, the equivalent of plantation exploitation in the context of capitalist resource extraction. Company towns could also be found in manufacturing. Towns were created around cotton mills in the Carolinas. As in coal mining districts, the mill owners contributed to local churches, schools, political parties, and candidates like mayors and judges. So-called public servants were so beholden financially to the employer capitalist few dared to speak out against him and on behalf of workers or the real public interest, even if so inclined, because they knew the boss man's money would always find someone willing to take it and play the game by his rules. So those who did not play by the rules, for such offenses as demanding back pay, organizing a union, and other crimes against property, could suffer not only discharge from employment, but eviction from company housing and chain gang time for failure to settle outstanding debts, as a vagrant now without gainful employment. Probably the most notorious example of industrial feudalism in the USA was Pullman, Illinois. In the latter 19th century, the manufacture of the Palace Railroad car, the luxury sleeper of 19th century rail travel, George Pullman built a model industrial community on 4,000 acres of land purchased for this purpose. It was to be a complete private community for his model workers. The church, school, stores, bank, library, utilities, and housing were all supervised by Pullman Company officials, charging monopoly rates for rents and services and prices for commodities to robustly underpaid employees. Pullman blackmailed the nearby village that if he did not supply him with public water, he'd build his own pumping station on Lake Michigan and they'd lose revenue from his community. Since all public improvements in the town of Pullman were paid for by the company, George demanded his taxes be reduced to the minimum possible rate under the law. Unsurprisingly, he again got his way. Foreman applied pressure on employees to vote for Pullman selected Republican candidates, providing transportation to the polls along with terminal repercussions for those observed putting non-Republican tickets in the voting boxes. In this way, a pro-labor community returned to pro-Pullman Republican candidates 99.98% of the time. Those recalling Soviet-style elections might feel proud that these methods were first tested on American soil in the name of preserving free enterprise. But there are even more egregious examples of corporate paternalism buried in the archives of the American past. If there were many company towns, there were also company states, most especially in the mining districts of the far west. The Amalgamated Copper Company, later the well-renamed Anaconda Copper Company, under the Morgan Guggenheim financial empire of Wall Street, was synonymous with the state of Montana, buying candidates from both parties, guaranteeing special legislation for corporate interest, judges selected from compliant party machines, and juries selected from company employees, with newspapers dependent on company advertising. So in control was this corporation that there was no possibility of ranching, farmer, or labor interests in the state getting anyone nominated who might challenge the corporate chokehold of Anaconda Copper. Suits brought in federal court led to the state's release from the anaconda grip during the Progressive era, bringing in some of the toughest election reform laws in the U.S., paving the way for Burton K. Wheeler, one of the strongest progressive and labor senators in American history. Thus we find the state of Montana's progressive era reform laws under heavy attack 100 years later after the Citizens United decision, and where the state of Montana will return if they are rolled back and the Koch brothers and ALEC get their way. Because two baristas, this is exactly what the ruling interests of Wall Street, the Supreme Court, state legislatures and courts, the Republican Party, and most of the Democratic Party in the U.S. Congress have in store for you. Today's vote should be a wake-up call, and that is to privatize all public institutions as well as public infrastructure, to reduce civil society to the margins between one company town and the next, and ensure that they're in control of even these shrinking slices of public domain. And it will be even more thorough and totalitarian than even George Pullman dared, because the corporate anaconda has expanded 1,000-fold from the 1880s, because there is no labor movement to offer resistance, because America has lost its progressive fighting tradition in favor of xenophobic nonsense movements like the Tea Party, paid for by the same corporate accounting offices. You will live in a world where you are spied on by corporate cameras with full civil powers, where they have the right to invade your body, label you a terrorist, as they once used the word anarchist, and break up any public meeting you might organize, or invade your home with drawn weapons. No, hell, they don't even have to do that. Because you owe so much on that overhauled hunk of prefab crap you call your home, they can just call in your mortgage and have you evicted. And not living in your car either, because they can pull the wheels right under you from there as well. No, there won't even be a hope of heaven for you, as Ernie Ford used to sing, because even God will have been bought off by the amalgamated anaconda of corporate power. You will not even have the mandatory ID necessary to pass the pearly gates, because your criminal background and debtor's history will preclude you from qualifying for one. So, does that sound kind of familiar to what you see already? Well, you ain't seen nothing yet. And so, what are you going to do about it? Well, let's see who that is. Probably the National Security Council or Homeland Security at the right time. Hello. Who? Eugene Debs, the old leader of the American Socialist Party, who ran for president of the United States from the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, the only place for an honest candidate. You want to remind us that you led the workers of Pullman, Illinois, in breaking the feudal regime of George Pullman away back yonder. But you didn't win, did you? The federal government heard Mr. Pullman's anguished cry and broke your mass strike on the railroad because it held up the U.S. mail, which depended on private carriers like the Illinois Railroad. See? But one thing can be learned from your lessons. When civil society has vanished, when the public interest has made the terms democracy and a republic, and they've gone the way of other ancient ruins, the only way left may be to imitate Spartacus or choose an honest prison over false freedom.